right, we'll go ahead and get started. So now I'd like to move to our next session, a fireside chat featuring two experts in the geopolitical landscape. And it's hard to consider economic issues without understanding the geopolitical backdrop. And our moderator today is Peter Krause. He's an assistant professor of political science in the Morrissey College of Arts and Sciences at Boston College, whose research focuses on international security, Middle East politics, political violence, and national movements. His book, Rebel Power: Why National Movements Compete, Fight, and Win, is forthcoming in the Cornell University Press. He's also working on a volume entitled The Power to Hurt: Coercion in Theory and Practice, and articles on territorial control, interstate negotiation, and the effectiveness of terrorism. He's previously published articles on the causes and effectiveness of political violence, U.S. intervention in the Syrian war, the politics of division within the Palestinian national movement, the war of ideas in the Middle East, and a reassessment of U.S. operations in Tora Bora in 2001. Prior to joining the faculty here at BC, he was a research fellow at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis, as well as a research fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. I think you spent some time at MIT, right?
I got a PhD there, yes.
PhD at MIT, which wasn't in here. Received his BA in political science and history from Williams and his PhD from MIT. Richard Haass, Dr. Richard Haass, is in his 13th year as president of the Council on Foreign Relations, an independent, nonpartisan member organization, think tank, and publisher dedicated to being a resource to help people better understand the world and foreign policy choices facing the United States and other countries. In 2013, he served as chair of the negotiations in Northern Ireland that provided the foundation for the 2014 Stormont-Haass Agreement, and for his efforts he received the 2013 Tipperary International Peace Award. From January 2001 to 2003, he was Director of Policy Planning for the Department of State, where he was a principal advisor to Secretary of State Colin Powell. Confirmed by the U.S. Senate, he holds the rank of ambassador. He also served as coordinator for policy toward the future of Afghanistan and U.S. envoy to the Northern Ireland peace process, and in recognition of his service, he received the State Department's Distinguished Honor Award. He has extensive additional government experience. He was Special Assistant to President George H.W. Bush, Senior Director for Near East and South Asian Affairs on the staff of the National Security Council. In 1991, he was awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal for his contributions during Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. He also served in the Department of State and Defense and was a legislative aide in the U.S. Senate. He served as Director of Foreign Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution, was a visiting professor of international studies at Hamilton College, a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a lecturer in public policy at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School, and a research associate at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. He's a Rhodes Scholar. He holds a BA from Oberlin College and a Master and Doctor of Philosophy degrees from Oxford University. He's also received numerous honorary degrees. He's an author or editor of 12 books on American foreign policy. His most recent books are Foreign Policy Begins at Home: The Case for Putting America's House in Order, and War of Necessity, War of Choice, a memoir of the two Iraq wars. We're excited to have both Peter and Richard here to discuss this important topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
After those introductions, we can go straight to questions.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Dan, for those wonderful introductions. Just to give you guys an overview, Richard and I will have a discussion for about 35 or 40 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So if questions come up in the course of our discussion or from your own thoughts, please hold on to those. There'll be time for that. I just want to say it's a great honor to be invited here to moderate at this conference and to speak with one of the best minds in international politics. To start, I think around international politics today, and it seems like one of the most fraught periods that certainly I can remember. We have instability in the Middle East. We have a rising but perhaps currently stumbling China. We have economic collapse, or borderline so, in Venezuela, and challenges in Brazil. Renewed domestic challenges to whether international trade and free trade is a good idea, and we're going to touch on each of these. But to start, I was just wondering, from your perspective, Richard, what are the most important foreign policy challenges that face the next president? And if I could add a second question, because I know that historically you've provided some advice to a number of presidential candidates. To what extent do you see a potential difference between a Clinton and Trump foreign policy?
Well, the good news is I could never remember second questions. So too bad. Look, it's everything you mentioned and a lot of other things are going to be in the new president's inbox. It's important to remember, during campaigns we forget that candidates can choose lots of things. They can choose what they say. They can choose to say what they're going to do. The only thing they can choose their vice president if they're nominated. The one thing they can't choose is the inbox that greets them in January if they were to win. That's the constant. And whoever is the next president, I expect there will be mornings that individual wonder why he or she wanted that job so badly. It is going to be a daunting inbox. And as was just laid out for you, the good news is it'll provide job security for the young man sitting next to me. He won't run out of issues to write about. But this combination of a Middle East that is in real chaos. You can choose the word, but I would say chaos or anarchy. And we'll talk about it, but don't assume it's bottomed out. You've seen the return of geopolitics and fundamental questions about the future of Europe. Asia, while on the surface things look relatively good against the backdrop of slowing economic performance, you are seeing again a rise of nationalism and geopolitical friction, and it's not clear it has the shock absorbers to deal with all the challenges. You mentioned, Peter, Venezuela, questions as well in some of the critical states in Africa and some others. And then at the global level, there's in virtually every global domain you can think of, from climate to cyber to trade, what have you, there's a gap between the scale of the challenges and the ability of the countries of the world to meet those challenges, what I would call a global gap. And then, as you mentioned, this doesn't take place in a vacuum, but it takes place against the context of the United States, which has been the principal driver of international relations for the last 3/4 of a century, at a time where the United States is quite divided politically and quite uncertain about the level of effort it wants to devote to the world, to add up significant regional challenges, a gap at the global level between challenges and consensus, and an increasingly divided and uncertain United States. And that ought to give you pause. And it certainly gives me pause. That's considerable. In terms of the two candidates, look, we were just talking about it before. Look, all we know is what the candidates are saying. And it's good most of you are sitting down, because shockingly enough, people who are running for president tend to say things that they believe will enhance their prospects of becoming president. It's the most radical thought you're going to hear this morning. And so I wouldn't assume necessarily, I wouldn't rule it out, but I just don't assume a one-to-one correspondence between what is said and what people would actually do. Plus, if they are to get elected, they wouldn't assume office, what, 5, 6, 7, 8 months from now? That's a long time in terms of, it's hard to know exactly what will be in your inbox come the end of January. Plus, I don't know the exact results of the congressional elections. I would think the Republicans are likely to keep the House. I don't know about the Senate. Republicans may keep it narrowly, may not. The one thing I am 100% sure of, there's going to be divided government effectively, simply because you're not going to have supermajorities and all that. So whoever is going to be the next president, he or she is going to have to deal with the reality of divided government, if you will, what the framers' intent of checks and balances. As Brandeis once said, the purpose of the Constitution was not to promote efficiency, and in some ways was to push back against the possibility of significant policy departures, not to preclude them, but to make it more difficult rather than less so. So it's difficult to know, but that said, sure. What we're seeing are clearly different directions in foreign policy. We'll learn a lot more, or somewhat more, about Secretary Clinton in a few hours. She's giving a major address today. I think it's in San Diego. So we'll know more about the allies. But all things being equal, because she has a track record as senator and a track record as Secretary of State, I would think the confidence, if you will, in large aspects of continuity would be fairly high, that the departures would probably be more retail departures rather than wholesale departures. And from Mr. Trump's articulated statements, if he were to actually try to carry them out, some of the departures would be considerably larger. He is, particularly in questions of trade, relations with allies, and so forth. But again, that's taking things at face value and assuming that one would want to and be able to implement, one would say. But all things being equal, yes, I think it's fair to say that you'd probably have more continuity than less with Hillary Clinton, and at least an effort to have less continuity than more if you were to have Donald Trump. And you have to then decide if you're more content than not with the way things are, whether more continuity than less would something you would welcome or something you would push back on.
Excellent. Well, let's start with the Middle East. So one of the things that I've been struck by, and I know as the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, you have one foot in the academic world, but also one foot in the policy community. There's been a big debate over the degree of intervention for the United States in the Middle East. If you look historically, back when President Bush was around, the big criticism was—
Which President Bush?
Oh, George W. Bush. So 8 to 16 years ago. The debate was intervening too much, getting us involved in costly wars. We need to really pull back from the region. Under President Obama, there's been somewhat the opposite criticism of, laying out red lines in Syria that we then don't back up. We've stayed too much out of the fray. That's hurt our credibility in the region. And so one of the questions is, and again, this has an academic connotation as well, there's a debate over restraint as kind of a grand strategy where you want to pull back versus kind of deep engagement where you want to stay involved. So I'm interested to know, what have we learned over the past 16 years for U.S. grand strategy in the Middle East, and what is the way forward?
I often point out that wars are fought 3 times. First, you have a debate about whether to engage the war, whether to go to war. Then you fight the war. Then you have a debate, a third war, over the lessons of the war. And for a lot of what you just mentioned, we're in round 3. The danger is that people will draw the wrong lessons. Or to put another way, they will draw lessons for all seasons, and there's virtually no lessons about intervention that are good for all seasons. Intervention per se is not good or bad. When I was writing for President Bush the father, Bill Safire, who I thought was one of the great columnists of the ages, wrote an article about a speech I'd written for President Bush the father, and he called it the "it depends" doctrine. And I thought that then, and I think it now. I think the answer is it depends. Intervention. I wrote a book about intervention that actually grew out of that speech, and interventions are not per se good or bad. It depends on the compared to what. All the other options. An intervention is not a switch. And interventions are a dial. There's all forms, as you know, from your writing, of interventions. So you can have interventions for narrow tasks that military forces can directly carry out, or you can have interventions for broad tasks that military forces can't accomplish. What they can do is provide a backdrop, and hopefully those things will happen. You've written about coercion, which is an example of that. I happen to believe that the intervention that became Desert Shield and Desert Storm was warranted. I called it a war of necessity, and I argued it was a good one. I was quite critical of the Iraq War of 2003. I called it an ill-advised war of choice, and I think history will be critical of George W. Bush for what he did and how he did it. I think for Barack Obama, I believe history will be critical both of what he's done and what he hasn't done. He will be criticized for interventions. I would think the Libya intervention will be high on the list of the criticisms. And he will also be more often criticized for what he didn't do, for drawing the red line, not responding to it, which I believe was probably the most consequential inaction of an American president in years, if not decades. I think he'll be criticized. And if you're like me, I actually wrote about it. I was critical of going into Libya, but then I said, if you're going to go in, you got to follow up. I thought he had the worst of all worlds. We went in, if you will, violated the Pottery Barn rule then, and we didn't take ownership of it. The idea that Libya was going to somehow just sort itself out was, to me, beyond a pipe dream. If one knew even a little bit about Libya. In other cases, pulling the troops out of Iraq or not doing more, I believe, which I thought was a totally doable task to get the Iraqis to accept a contingent of American soldiers, I thought was a mistake. The Afghanistan timeline I believe, was a mistake. So I believe history will be quite critical of President Obama, both for what he's done, what he hasn't done, and how he's done it. So what this adds up to is 16 years of a lot of difficulties with intervention, and I'm not going to say again, it's something for historians to argue out, but it's obviously one of the contributing factors to the reality that is today's chaos or anarchy in much of the Middle East. Middle Easterners themselves, I would argue, deserve an even larger degree of the responsibility for why their part of the world is as bad as it is. But outsiders, and particularly the United States, have clearly played a quote-unquote helping hand.
Great. So one follow-up question. When I was starting out studying political science, I read a book called Does America Need a Foreign Policy by Henry Kissinger. And in some sense, it argued the opposite of what you were saying, of kind of suggesting that we need a consistent policy because if we don't have one, it's tougher to reassure allies. Obviously, you can decide whether to go into a given country or not, but things like forced deployment, things you know much better than I do, you need to plan out kind of long in advance. And so a lot of the debate is, should we be having, multiple carrier groups in the Middle East stationed there for rapid reaction or not? So I'm interested to know what you think of the costs and benefits of that.
Okay, well, two things. There's a difference between saying, should America have a foreign policy, and should that policy always then argue for or against intervention? I would say, yes, we should have a foreign policy for any number of reasons, in order to send messages to actual or would-be adversaries, to send messages to actual or would-be friends, to prepare the American people for what might be asked of them, to scale and direct investments in military instruments, foreign policy instruments, what have you. But that doesn't mean we should have a consistent, we either always intervene or not. Again, it depends upon the situation. What are your interests? What are you likely to achieve? At what cost? What are the alternatives from doing nothing to using a different balance of instruments? So that's I think it's important to distinguish between the strategic and the tactical. Strategically, we need a foreign policy doctrine. I think there's an argument for predictability and consistency. Tactically, though, how we implement the doctrine of military intervention is simply one form of implementation. That's got to be varied, and you get into trouble with any set of extremes there. That'll get you into deep kimchi, as it is, to use the technical phrase. So I did forget now the second part of your question. I apologize.
Oh, it's okay. I think you answered it pretty well. I would love actually to talk about the Middle East all day, but let's move on to another topic.
Pretty well. Does that get you like a B or an A here? Boston College.
I'd say A. I think A.
That's good. That's good. Okay. So it's like Harvard. Everybody gets an A. That's good to know.
There's actually quite a bit of push down on grade inflation here, but yeah, when you have great students who have studied and had experience in the region.
Oh, are you running for most popular professor award? There we go. There we go.
If anyone's in the audience, do you want to do evaluations? Okay, so if we were to look at the largest geopolitical development in the past 2 decades, and I would probably say the foreseeable future, again, much as I would say it's something in the Middle East, it's really the rise of China. And so the question I have for you, Richard, is, for a long time, we've seen these graphs of growth of China, and is it going to pass the United States in 2030 or 2040 or 2050? And the optimists in that area have taken a step back the past couple of years with a lot of the domestic problems that China's had, both economically, environmentally, and otherwise. So my question for you is a weakening China or a strengthening China a greater challenge to East Asia and to the United States? And which one do you think we're more likely to see over the next decade?
It's a great question. So that can be flattering too. And the answer is they're both challenging, just in different ways. And I don't know which way it goes. I mean, I think the way you set it up is exactly right. China was growing at this extraordinary rate of double-digit growth for 3+ decades. That's over, never to come back. The only question now among the narrow experts is how slow is China's economy growing? And even that question is not a very good question, because whatever level it's growing at, it's still to some extent artificial growth because of continued infusions of a large amount of government money. So if China can gear up the economy if it wants by not allowing certain state-owned enterprises to go under, which is exactly, by the way, what they're doing. But the fact is, the effective growth rate of China's economy, I think, is way down. I remember several years ago, I shouldn't say who it was, someone who manages a very large investment company. It was the first time I heard of it, and he said, China's growing below 5%. And I said, what? Because the official numbers were 8 or 9% at the time. I said, what? He said, yeah, we're measuring everything that's going in or out. There's a massive slowdown going on in China. He said, the government numbers are baloney. And so that was the first I heard about, and I started looking at it. And I actually think it's right. And I think the numbers now are considerably below 5 or 6%. But again, the larger truth is it doesn't matter what the real numbers are as opposed to the official numbers, because the reality is one that it's dramatically slower. And Larry Summers has written about it, that China's, even though it's a developing economy, it's far more mature than it was. Impossible to sustain certain kinds of rates. Plus, a lot of the contradictions are keeping up with it. Now, that said, the optimists will remind you quite properly that the base of the Chinese economy is much larger. So if you're a $5 trillion economy, whatever, and you're growing at 5%, the delta every year that you're adding that is quite significant. You don't have to be growing at 10% that you needed to grow at if you were a $2.5 trillion economy to have the same amount of added GDP. So I think it's important to kind of keep that in mind. But that said, it's slowing. What I think we're seeing are two things. One is we're seeing a political bit of a crackdown associated with it. I think what the Chinese leadership is worried about is that with increasing disaffection over it, because in some ways what's happened is the party there has lost the lubricant and the source of legitimacy that came with extraordinarily high levels of economic growth. And you're beginning to see greater friction in the society, all sorts of measures of that, strikes, protests, and so forth. I think the anti-corruption campaign in part is a preemptive response to it as well. And so, but China faces something of a contradiction if you read the works of David Shambaugh and others about how do you get the benefits of a vibrant open economy without having a vibrant open society. Neat trick if you can pull it off, you can't pull it off. So there's that. And then there's a big foreign policy debate which says as China slows down economically, again, as the party no longer derives as much popular support from extremely high levels of economic growth, does the party begin to turn to venting nationalism, a more assertive national security policy as a way of compensating, be it in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and whatever, something of a debate going on there. So the answer to your question is it's both. A China that is continuing to do well will inevitably, as we've seen, translate some of its greater wealth into a greater capacity, and that capacity at some point, they have political constituencies that want to do things, and China will see itself as playing a certain role in the region and the world. And there's the risk that a China that's not doing well might turn to foreign policy as a bit of a distraction, as a way to compensate for a loss of performance. So either way, we've got to be, I would say, conscious of China. It's not an argument, though, for a containment strategy, which I do not believe is warranted for all sorts of reasons. It is, what it requires for us, it's the general jargon is a hedging strategy. We work with China where we can, but we push back where we have to, and we prepare for certain types of challenges. It requires then tremendous deftness, DEFT-ness on our side, bit of nuance. It's not a one-dimensional, it's not a policy for all seasons. It might mean we have to cooperate with China on Tuesdays and Thursday mornings on this set of issues in this part of the world, but push back against China on Wednesdays and Friday afternoons on these issues in another part of the world. To pull that off and to manage the domestic and alliance politics, that will be extraordinarily demanding for us, and I just hope we're up to it. I hope China is up to it as well, because they've got their own domestic management of the relationship, because how this relationship plays out will actually have a tremendous impact on the character of 21st century history. Think about the difference. If we have to tackle all these regional and global problems, either with the burden of something that looks like a US-China Cold War, or if the United States and China are able to cooperate more often than not. A tremendous difference in how we wake up every morning and deal with regional and global challenges. And I don't know how it's going to play out. 30 more seconds. There's a group of people, Graham Allison's done a lot of work on it, as you know, at Harvard and elsewhere, the Belfer Center where you are, write about this Thucydides complex, but the idea, the pattern and history of great existing powers and rising powers to have a relationship defined by friction in the way that Athens and Sparta did. So one way to think about one of the great diplomatic challenges of this era is how do we avoid that? How do we avoid having history, if you will, repeat itself in the case of the United States and China? It's not inevitable it goes badly, but it's possible. And I would think for each country, it's got to be at the top of the list of their diplomatic challenges.
Excellent. I absolutely agree it's possible. I mean, certainly different cultural contexts, but the last rise of a great power, the United States, was able to manage its relationship with Great Britain, the previous hegemon, so there is some precedent there. Let's deep dive just for just a minute on a China issue that you brought up, which is the South China Sea. And you mentioned the containment strategy that you don't favor. So I'm interested to know, you critiqued a bit the Obama administration on the red lines that were drawn but not backed up in Syria. As far as I know, they haven't drawn a specific red line publicly or rhetorically in the South China Sea, but there's a great deal of debate inside the U.S. military, among academics and policymakers, of how should the United States respond to the creation of these islands that were formerly reefs. Should we be sending ships through within the 12-mile corridor? I'm interested to know your insights on that and how that relates to these larger issues you were talking about.
I actually think the administration here has done a better job, particularly recently in Asia, the Asia Pacific, than they've done in the Middle East. And I think it's a combination. China's done certain things, for those of you who haven't followed it all that closely. A unilateral declaration of an air defense identification zone, various island building and claiming, shall we say. To be fair, so some of its neighbors have also done a little bit of claiming of territorial seas and the rest. So the U.S. has obviously not recognized any of the unilateralism. We've done overflights, we've done some sail-throughs, and I think that's the right sort of thing. You had the president's trip to Vietnam the other day, which I thought was a good step, and send certain messages to China. We've obviously expanded our relationship in the East China Sea with Japan. It's a tricky thing. What you want to do is discourage unilateralism by China, as well as others. And part of this diplomatic challenge is also going to be discouraging our friends here from doing things which are unwise or unnecessarily provocative. So how do you give support but not blank checks? So again, this is going to be a situation to be managed. Actually, in terms of Asia more broadly, I would say there's lots of issues out there. You're not going to get agreements on where to draw lines. You're not going to get agreements on who owns this rock in the ocean or this tiny island. What you're going to have to try to do is get understandings and arrangements about how to manage a situation absent formal agreement on who owns what. And that's the best you can hope for. That's not bad, and that's ambitious, by the way. But that's where we are. But if you look at the map of Asia, you still have lingering, not just a divided Korean peninsula, but you got the Russian, Japanese islands, you got Japan, China, you got half dozen countries with claims in the South China Sea. You got China, India still have some. So none of these things is likely to be resolved. The real question is, can you keep them from becoming incidents? And if they were to become incidents, can you prevent incidents from escalating into conflicts? So this is, to me, a traditional, classic diplomatic challenge. It's in the realm, unlike the Middle East, a lot of this is in the realm of the doable.
Excellent. So this is a finance conference, and I'm sure there's a great number of people in the audience interested about international economics, so let's talk about that for just a moment. On the issue of free trade, we all know the theories behind comparative advantage and the idea that lowering international barriers leads to a net benefit for societies, but as Larry Summers was talking about in the last panel, we've seen the rise domestically in the United States, both from polling and candidates like Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, increasingly having a backlash against free trade, saying that even if there is some type of net benefit, it has concentrated costs on workers and other individuals who are very upset with that. So what I'm interested to hear from your perspective, Richard, is to what extent do you think this is kind of a blip on the radar versus a longer-term trend? And how do you think this is seen internationally regarding the United States' continued support for free trade internationally?
We had an internal meeting yesterday where I work at the Council on Foreign Relations, where I began it with just your question.
Great.
And what's likely to happen after the election? And to what extent are what we're seeing in the support for Donald Trump and the support for Bernie Sanders, and even the fact that Hillary Clinton, who was one of the architects of TPP, has now distanced herself from it. To what extent is this simply a transitional blip, or to what extent is this the new normal? The answer is I don't know, but I fear it's more the new normal. In part because trade is being blamed or scapegoated or held accountable for lots of stuff going on, which is not trade-induced, but is technological innovation-induced. And the pace of technological innovation ain't going to slow. If anything, it's going to accelerate with artificial intelligence and 3D printing and driverless cars and you name it. And what this suggests to me is job displacement. The churn, if anything, is going to intensify, which poses, I believe, extraordinarily difficult challenges to our societies. I don't care if you're a democratic society or a non-democratic society, the fact of large-scale job displacement is an enormous challenge, and then the questions of retraining, education, what do you do about people who do become long-term unemployed? I think these are big, big issues. And I think the reality of that, or the fear of that, is one of the things that's driving both parties to where they are. I think it's rough news for trade. Like the WTO has ceased to be a negotiating forum. The WTO now is a dispute resolution forum. That's kind of its last remaining real function. The Doha development round, if it's not dead, it's on prolonged life support. And trade at the global level is no longer negotiated. Again, it's adjudicated. It provides a courtroom for dealing with certain disputes. But the real issue is trade is now negotiated regionally or multilaterally or bilaterally. I think that's likely to be case. It's the case in multilateralism more broadly. I think kind of UN General Assembly style multilateralism is increasingly unworkable. Just too many players in the room, too many of the important players aren't in the room, NGOs and corporations and others. So UN style, General Assembly style multilateralism is pretty much, I think, been overtaken by events. I do think there's a serious challenge to rebuild the constituency in our country, in the United States, for free trade. I'm still one of those who believes it's on balance beneficial economically. And I believe it's not even a close call, it's tremendous on balance beneficial strategically. Interesting enough, with friends and foes alike. It's a way to wire in and support friends, but also it's a way to, through interdependence, to restrain problems. One of the real successful examples, by the way, of this is the Taiwan-China relationship. One of the reasons I believe we haven't had real problems between Taiwan and China over the last, 65 or so years, is because of the growing economic interdependence between them. And I think one could make that case more broadly. But I do believe that building domestic support for trade is going to mean things like greater portability of certain safety nets. It's going to mean different types of teaching, education, retraining possibilities, and so forth. It's going to mean more emphasis on certain types of vocational life. I just gave a commencement talk at University of New Hampshire the other day about, and the whole theme of it was on lifelong education. But right now people come to places, wonderful schools like BC, and you finish when you're 22, 23, 25. Well, the idea that you're going to be able to sail down the highway of life for 50 more years based on what you got here. I don't care how good your teachers are here. I don't care how smart you are. Zero chance that what you get out of your experience here will fill up your intellectual tank of gas enough to get you down the next 50 years. I don't care if you're driving a Tesla. It won't work. So what we're going to have to do is rebuild education in this society so you can go fill up, top off your tank every 5 or 10 years. If the average career now has 10 to 15 jobs, we have to think about an educational system that will allow you 10 or 15 times in your life to acquire skills and knowledge that you didn't get in your late teens or early 20s. We are simply not there. But until we begin to move there, I believe we're going to be facing a real uphill challenge on issues like immigration and free trade.
Excellent. Well, that's a great segue to talking a bit about your last book, which you wrote about not just these international challenges, but how the United States needed to get its domestic house in order and be able to meet them. So the question I have is, as you noted before, there's gridlock in Congress. We're probably going to have another divided government. Even if we can identify the things that need to be done domestically, to what extent are you optimistic that those changes can actually be made?
Not very. Actually, that reminds me of an old question. It was an old joke about Soviet Union where Leonid Brezhnev or someone was asked about the Soviet economy. And he thought about it and he said, in a word, good. And someone said, well, Mr. General Secretary, could you at least give us 2 words? Not good. So it's hard for me to be wildly optimistic. Because the structural things that have made American politics what they're, the way we fund, the weakening of party structures. Larry was talking about the craziness that you pay 6% to a real estate agent when you purchase a house. Well, most of you don't go to travel agents anymore. You go Expedia or you do it online. Well, increasingly parties are getting disintermediated. We're seeing in American politics, you want to run for president, if you're Bernie Sanders, you don't turn to the Democratic Party to operate your fundraising, you do it directly. Or if you're Donald Trump, you don't ask the RNC to do something, you post your tweet. So what we're beginning to see is the effect of disintermediation of parties in American politics, which is at best a mixed blessing, because parties, whatever their drawbacks, were also did a lot to broker compromise and oil the wheels of government. And so right now you have each senator, each congressman is in some ways much more his own independent political actor. Media in this country, the age of broadcasting is over. You add up the total number of people who watch the nightly news or the morning shows, what is it, 15, 20 million people? Say I'm wrong, say it's 30 million people. That's 10% if it's 30 million. Instead, we're a country of narrowcasters. You watch MSNBC, you watch Fox, you watch CNN, you listen to this show or that show, you go on this website, and increasingly people are going to places that tend to reinforce their own biases. We want to feel vindicated and comfortable, not pushed and challenged. All these things, I add all this up, and I hate being pessimistic, so you probably want to go to the next question, but it's hard for me to see, though, very quickly how it is we change this. Something you said about trade, I think, is true more broadly. Which is the losers, or more broadly, people who are affected directly or think they're affected directly by an issue bring a degree of political intensity into the political arena that dwarfs others. It's the reason that you could have 90% of Americans wanting background checks on gun before you could buy a gun, but the bill was defeated. Why? Because the 10% of Americans who don't want to have background checks, this is, for them, a defining issue. And they will put all their economic and political clout behind it. And they'll say, I will support you or oppose you based upon this one issue alone. For the 90%, most of them who felt the other way, well, this is one of the things we'd throw into the hopper when we decided what our political behavior would be. So intensity in American politics far dominates overall numbers. And it's the reason that it's so hard to change entitlements. It's the reason that it's hard to change gun laws. And it's the reason, I think, in lots of areas, it's going to be very difficult to get things done. There's a lot of writing, whether it's in the Federalist Papers or subsequently, about factionalism in American politics, and a lot of social science, again, about how democracies, as they mature, both tend to get more sclerotic and more factionalized. And I think we're seeing elements of it in the United States, which again is, it's easier to diagnose than it is to fix, but I think it's real.
So the last question I have before we open it up, I think that the basis of your speech at UNH is great. I'll tell you, a lot of the faculty in the audience will be very happy to hear we need more education. Keep coming back to us. We're happy to give you some insights there. But one of the things I think about...
No, it may not be coming back to the campuses.
Fair enough. We have to earn it. We have to earn it. Yeah. So that's actually the basis of my question, though.
You're also being disintermediated. And a lot of American higher education should be nervous about it, where the cost structure in American higher education has in some ways ignored the market. And certain places won't be viable, and certain places are going to increasingly face challenge. Because I think disintermediation, when people say, is it worth, whatever it is, $200,000 for a 4-year thing, or later on, should I pay this amount? I would think the educational market is ripe for a bit of disruption in ways that we haven't heretofore seen. And I actually think it's going to be an interesting experiment to watch over the next generation, but it's going to happen.
So I think that's a great point. So building off of that, to the extent people do get education now, one of the biggest places they do is from the media. So the last question I have is, this whole Ben Rhodes story, which I think in terms of the tone of it has been, a bit overblown. But it does bring up an interesting issue regarding, relations between the media and people in think tanks or people in DC and policymakers and the public. So I'm interested to know how healthy you think that relationship is. And to what extent can the American people or citizens in general rely on the media for accurate reporting, holding politicians' feet to the fire, et cetera?
It probably hasn't been the greatest year for the media in its history. Look, the media is a business. It's both a calling and a business. And there's a tension between the two. And there's a tension between media putting out what you think people need to hear and then running a business where you've got to run it more about what they want to read or hear. It's an interesting piece, and I think it's the current Vanity Fair. I read it online yesterday about the New York Times as it's struggling. This is, one of the most venerable institutions in America. You have it, the challenge between ratings and everything else, and we've seen it over the last year. Media Times is worried about losing access to certain people. I got a call I'm getting lots of calls if I want to comment on Hillary Clinton's speech later today, and one of them called, who shall go nameless, called me to ask if I would do it. And while we were deciding, they called back and said, never mind, we decided we didn't want to have an analyst, we wanted to have partisans on the show, which I thought was quite interesting. I took it as a compliment, actually, since I was seen as someone who was more analytical than a partisan. Look, I think media, it's the reason, by the way, you've also had things like ProPublica grow up and emerge, which I play an important, to do certain types of investigative reporting. Look, there's still there's still pockets of real excellence in media, certain shows, certain papers, certain magazines, but there's lots that ain't. And so you got to be wary of what it is, what's advocacy, what's description. Media is not as good as analysis. It's not its business to do prescription. That's why we have editorial pages. But it's an uneven landscape. And it's a place for organizations like mine then to put out analysis to basically contribute to the public debate. And it puts a lot more demands on the reader or the viewer, because you've got to think a lot about what's the explicit or implicit agenda of what's coming at you. Not just what they're saying, but what is it they're not saying. What are they not? And I've got a real problem with often the lack of international coverage, which I think feeds into some of the tendencies in this country that the world doesn't matter, and so forth. I don't think the media does a particularly thoughtful job of covering the world and its impact. And I won't say anything more about that interview, because that interview was bad for my blood pressure. But I'll leave it
Fair
at
enough.
that.
So read Foreign Affairs, great way to go. If you don't know, that's produced by Council on Foreign Relations, best international affairs journal out there. All right, with that, we will close this part of the session, and open it up to questions. So please, I don't know if we raise hands or whatnot, but Richard, you're happy to
Sure.
go for it.
No tour of the world now can be complete without talking about North Korea.
Sure.
And it just seems like a terrible
Yeah, I agree.
situation. What do you think our policy stance should be towards this? And to what extent do you think that in the frustration of the moment, probability is that
Sure.
really will change?
Question was about North Korea and what we should be doing and what's the risk. Look, this has been a U.S. policy failure for a quarter of a century. We have basically faced a North Korean challenge of developing nuclear weapons. And when there were opportunities to act, we didn't. And we instead talked. And the North Koreans, I believe, has essentially used the 2+ decades of talking as a cover to develop a significant nuclear program. And whether they have 10 or 8 or 12 nuclear weapons remains to be seen, but they're building greater capacity to produce enriched material. They're also got missiles. They're also working on warhead miniaturization. It's quite possible that before the end of the first term of the next president, so that's by 2019, 2020, if not soon thereafter, the Director of National Intelligence will come into the Oval Office and say, Mr. President, Madam President, we now believe North Korea either can put small warheads on missiles that can reach California, or will soon be able to. And because nothing, even the most recent resolution that denounced them in the UN ratchet up sanctions. It's not going to change that. And so very quickly, I believe the United States is going to have to decide whether it can live with the reality of a North Korean nuclear capability, not just the one of 10 nuclear weapons, but maybe 15, 20, 25, maybe more, that can target the United States, even with inaccurate missiles. We're going to have to decide whether that's an acceptable or tolerable situation, in which case we then have to think about what kind of defensive arrangements we build against it in terms of missile systems. We're beginning to do that with South Korea and Japan. What sort of declaratory strategy we would have in terms of, in order to bolster deterrence, and what if any red lines we would declare. Or we could decide that this is intolerable, and what it is we might do in order to try to deal with it in various preventive ways. We've got to the point where these are, shall we say, wildly unattractive options, but that's where the debate is. We're actually coming out with a big study on it from the Council. We commissioned a task force on it, just because we believe it's that important. And we don't believe it's getting the kind of serious attention. It's almost like we've grown too comfortable with it. I don't know what the North Koreans are going to do. When I was back in government, North Korea was on the short list of most difficult places to analyze. Any country that so concentrates power in one individual is almost an impossible intelligence target. North Korea, on top of that, is an awfully difficult place to penetrate. So who knows what the regime might do in terms of something reckless. They've certainly done it any number of times in the past. I believe China here is central. 2/3 or 3/4 of North Korea's trade goes in and out through Chinese territory. If China wants to put pressure on North Korea, trust me, they could. Problem is, China's, as much as they don't like North Korea, they're scared of doing it. So one of the questions is there a dialogue with China that we and others could have that would reassure them about futures on the Korean Peninsula that might be less worrisome than the future of a North Korean collapse or North Korean nuclear capabilities and what that might mean? I don't know. But so I think there's options we're going to have to consider with China, and there's options we're going to have to consider postures vis-a-vis North Korea. But get ready for that debate. It's coming, and it's coming fast. Do you want me to call people?
Yeah,
yes,
go
sir.
for it, Richard.
Is Iran the next North Korea? Not necessarily. The current agreement with Iran essentially buys pretty much 14 more years, assuming Iran compliance, and I believe Iran will largely comply with the agreement. For those of you who haven't read the joint agreement in the last few hours, but the agreement that was reached last summer essentially brings down Iranian capabilities in the nuclear realm considerably, dramatically reduces their enriched material, dramatically reduces the number of active centrifuges for 10 years, enriched uranium for 15 years. And as a result, the benefit is that if tomorrow Iran decides it wants to develop nuclear weapons, the odds of us catching them early on in that process and being able to do something about it have gone up, so-called warning time, whatever. Now, in exchange for that, we transferred lots of resources, and we may allowed Iran to do other things, but let's just put that aside. In terms of the nuclear, the real challenge is going to come, I believe, after these ceilings on centrifuges and enriched material come off. Because after that happens, the only thing that would constrain Iran at that point is their non-proliferation treaty pledges and the inspections arrangements they've signed up for. And there's nothing then at that point that they couldn't either decide to leave the non-proliferation treaty and maybe not announce it, or do stuff outside. And as the president and others have acknowledged, that after these 10 and 15-year ceilings expire, then the warning time we would potentially have begins to diminish and effectively go way, way, way down. So I believe that the Iranian nuclear challenge has largely probably been constrained for 10 or 15 years significantly, maybe even been reduced, but it dramatically returns down the road. It's one of the reasons that I would have not signed an agreement of such limited durations. And it was something of a debate on the US side, and I believe that we should have held out for an agreement of longer durations. It's not at all clear to me that of short duration will be sufficiently reassuring to some of Iran's neighbors that they might not want to have nuclear programs of their own. And if you think the Middle East is bad now, just imagine that one. And also, I'm not one who believes that over the next 10 or 15 years, Iran is guaranteed or even likely to evolve in ways that we wouldn't be as concerned if they were going to go down the nuclear path. I call that wishery, not strategy. Might happen, but I don't see any reason to count on it. So I believe that this is largely a problem that's been, a nuclear Iran, largely been delayed, but it's in no way been eliminated. Sure.
Speak on our evolving relationship with Saudi Arabia, given
Sure.
their financial strain and our increasing energy independence?
Questions about the Saudis and our relationship with them. Look, it's actually quite emblematic of a lot of relationships. In our business, we throw around words like friends, allies, enemies, all too cavalierly. Saudi Arabia is a good example of a country that doesn't quite neatly fit. We agree on some things, but we disagree on many others. And for years, they were spreading around money. They're actually better on it now, but for years, their funding of various Islamic institutions around the Middle East and the world has had a tremendously adverse impact. We obviously have disagreed at times on Syria. We've disagreed about the Israeli-Palestinian relationship. We're not dependent directly on Saudi Arabia in terms of oil. Saudi Arabia has the world's probably second largest reserves after Venezuela, but Saudi Arabia is still essential to the world oil market. If you're talking about a world oil market of plus or minus 90 million barrels a day, Saudi Arabia is pumping 1 out of every 9 of them. And the cushion right now in the global energy market between world supply and world demand is less than 1 million barrels a day. So if Saudi Arabia were suddenly, for choice or out of simply events, took 2 million barrels of oil off the market, your gas would not be costing $2.39 at the pump anymore. So the United States is still dramatically affected. That's why I don't use the phrase energy independence. We may be energy self-sufficient net. But we're not energy independent either directly because we still need to import 4 million barrels a day to offset the gap between what we import in our refineries, but also we're so dependent on the rest of the world economically. I think the real question, I guess there's 2 real questions. Can the United States and Saudi Arabia work out this complicated relationship? And secondly, can Saudi Arabia remain stable? I think there's real questions about Saudi Arabian stability given what I believe was a strategic misadventure in Yemen, which is a real example of overreach. I've called it Saudi Arabia's Vietnam. The fact that oil is as low, Saudi reserves are not what they were, financial reserves. Royal infighting. And the fact that Saudi Arabia will come under pressure at some point, more pressure than it has from ISIS. Because ISIS is going to say, it is the real Islamic State, not the country and the monarchy that's sitting over the holy places of Islam. So I don't take Saudi Arabia in its current form, I don't take it for granted. So I think there's real issues between the United States and Saudi Arabia is how they deal with this Middle East. Like if I'm right, the Middle East is still early on in what would be a latter day 30 years war. So how the United States and Saudi Arabia navigate their relationship amidst such a Middle East in which Saudi Arabia itself may come under greater pressure, that's going to be a serious test. Any diversity here? Not yet. Yes, sir.
Are you concerned about the economic stagnation in Europe right now?
Am I concerned about economic stagnation in Europe? It's one of about 11 things I'm concerned about in Europe. Yeah, I mean, I used to work on Europe a lot. When I began in this field in the 70s, and after I was at Oxford, I went to the Institute for Strategic Studies, which was in London. And the big geopolitical issues of the day in the 70s were largely happening in Europe, things like the Euro missile debate and all that. And that was all weathered. The Cold War was weathered. And Europe, in some ways, became just downright boring. I mean, the EU is many things, but basically was boring. I mean, if you've spent any time in Brussels, if you've ever had to sit through NATO meetings, I mean, there was nothing more difficult as an American diplomat than to be jet lagged and sit through a NATO meeting. It was tough stuff, trust me. And I didn't always pass that test. But now Europe's become exciting. And I don't mean that as a compliment. It's really worrying. I mean, you've got the return of geopolitics with what the Russians, did in Crimea as well as Eastern Ukraine, what they could do. You got NATO re-NATOizing. After we kind of de-NATOized a lot of Europe, we're now re-NATOizing parts of Europe. You've got all the refugee issues. You've got structural low economic growth. And I don't see that changing. I think Japan's a real warning here. I mean, what I think, as a 1-minute digression, but I don't know if Larry got into this, in which case I apologize because he knows a lot more about it than I do. But what we've basically seen is a world that's tried to operate on the basis of what central bankers alone can do. And I think central bankers have been quite creative for the most part. But at the end of the day, they are just central bankers. They don't control fiscal policy, and they don't control fundamental issues of political and economic reform. So whether it's the Bank of Japan or Mario Draghi, there's just limits to what they can do. And you don't have social compacts that allow dramatically different fiscal arrangements, taxation, and it's very hard to do certain things with taxing, even harder to do certain things with reducing spending in Europe. And structural reform is, again, extraordinarily difficult. So I don't see the combination of geopolitics, refugees, and the political pushback against real structural reform, no. I don't see Europe. And one thing I've left out is demographics. What, again, Europe and Japan face is tremendous demographic challenges.
We have time. Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry. So no, I don't see Europe coming out of this. And the fact that we're seeing the populist rise, we're seeing that's the canary in the coal mine. It'd be very interesting to see, what are we now, 3 weeks away from the Brexit vote. The last 3 polls averaged out even. It'll be very interesting to see how the vote goes there about whether there's a closet Remain vote or a closet populist vote. But I do think Europe is in some ways in play in ways that if we had had this meeting 2 or 3 years ago, it never would have occurred to me to even imagine that Europe would face the raft of issues and its future be as uncertain as it is now. It would not have occurred to me 3 years ago.
Wonderful. We have time for just one last question.
You call it. I'm not going to make the last one.
All right. Well, there's only one choice. So that's easy. Right here. Thank you.
What's your opinion on European no-go zones, and are they coming here to the United States?
What do you mean by no-go zones? Oh, you mean like in certain neighborhoods and all that? Yeah, well, most of the part, mostly from what I can tell, they're not true. The idea that these zones, quote unquote, exist. And look, that said, I think Europe has historically not been as successful as we have been at integrating immigrant groups. They've also got larger percentages than we had in certain cases. We basically, have done, all things being equal, a better job at making the society open. Europeans have not been just culturally, it's more of a cultural move than a political or economic move. So I think they have the reality that they've got certain populations that don't feel as part of the society. They now have the added burden of massive numbers coming at once. The challenge for Germany, for example, is not simply housing, feeding, and clothing an enormous number of people. At one point, it was over 8,000 a day, which would be the equivalent for us of over 30,000 a day. But then it's the long-term social integration, education, jobs, what have you. That's a tough challenge. I think we've done better at it, and we have to be careful we don't muck it up. And I think it's important that it actually comes back to the first question. I think it's important that we keep open the promise of upward mobility in this society. What has made this country tick more than anything else is this sense of possibility and upward mobility. And I reject the inequality, but inequality is not the problem. We've always had inequality in this country. What we've also always had is opportunity and mobility. And the danger will be if mobility and opportunity are not available to most Americans. And what we've got to think hard about as a society is how do we make sure they are? And that gets into, it's everything from attitudes to access to education, to access to health care, and so forth. And that's where we've got to get it right. In Europe, what worries me, sorry to go on so long, but But Europe has had a problem, and it's affected immigrants and others, which is it's been more rigid socially. And Europe has suffered more from class distinctions and all that. We as a society, I would argue, have to be very careful that the United States does not become increasingly defined by class, because then we will have problems with people who feel left out of upward mobility, and that will affect immigrants and that will affect non-immigrants alike. And I think what we're seeing in this campaign is a bit of a warning shot. It's a bit of a message. But no, I'm not worried about what you say. And also I think, one last thing, 30 more seconds, sorry to go so long. This balance between civil liberties, privacy, collective security, I think we've gotten it more right than the Europeans, and they're playing catch up. So no, I don't think we have I don't think we have a significant problem, which is not to say there won't be individual incidents. Of course there can be. But by and large, I think we've done a far better job than the Europeans have done of integrating immigrants and making them feel part of the social fabric. We just got to make sure we keep it that way.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Peter. Thanks for that great discussion.